In the seconds it takes you to read this sentence, 260 people died. It was not a storm, it was not a navigation error, it was not an obvious structural failure. It was something modern commercial aviation had never seen before. A Boeing 787 Dreamliner, one of the most advanced aircraft in the world, losing both engines 3 seconds after takeoff. And what happened inside that cockpit over the following 29 seconds remains, to this day, one of the most disturbing questions in the history of aviation. On June 12, 2025, at 13:38 local time, Air India Flight AI171 began its takeoff roll on the runway at Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel International Airport in Ahmedabad in the state of Gujarat, northwestern India. It was a routine journey, Ahmedabad to London Gatwick, one of the 5 weekly flights Air India had operated on that route since 2023. The destination was the United Kingdom. Most of the passengers were Indians from the diaspora returning home, families who had spent weeks or months visiting relatives in Gujarat and who were now closing their suitcases with the same mixture of melancholy and relief felt by those saying goodbye to a place they love, but to which they no longer fully belong. The aircraft was a Boeing 787-8 Dreamliner, registration VTANB, manufactured in 2013 and delivered to Air India in January 2014. With 41,868 accumulated flight hours on the airframe, it was a mature aircraft but within normal operating parameters for an aircraft of that generation. Its 2 General Electric GEnx-1B70 engines had accumulated between 28,000 and 33,000 operating hours, and both had been installed less than 3 months before the accident. The aircraft had been declared airworthy. It was not carrying dangerous goods. The navigation systems were operating normally. Nothing in the aircraft's immediate technical history suggested what was about to happen. There were 230 passengers and 12 crew members on board. The passengers included 169 Indian citizens, 53 British citizens, 7 Portuguese citizens and 1 Canadian citizen. 13 of the passengers were minors, 2 of them infants. The human composition of the flight was typical of a route connecting the South Asian diaspora with its country of origin, people with lives divided between continents, family commitments in India and professional lives in Europe, visits that end with farewells at airports. For many on board, that flight marked the end of a holiday. For others, it was the return after months away. For everyone, it was a routine journey. In the cockpit, Captain Sumit Sabharwal, aged 56, occupied the left seat. Sabharwal was a veteran of Indian aviation. He had accumulated approximately 15,600 flight hours, almost 8,600 of them on the 787 itself. He had trained at the Indira Gandhi Rashtriya Uran Academy, India's leading aviation school, and his colleagues remembered him as a meticulous, reserved pilot, incapable of becoming agitated in high-pressure situations and deeply committed to his career. His friends, who spoke to the Wall Street Journal after the accident, described a man who cared for his elderly father, mentored younger pilots, and found in aviation not merely a job, but an identity. First Officer Clive Kunda, aged 32, occupied the right seat. He was the one flying the aircraft at the moment of takeoff in the operational role known as pilot flying, while Sabharwal served as pilot monitoring, that is, the pilot who supervises the instruments and systems while the other operates the controls. Kunda, described by those who knew him as passionate about aviation and enthusiastic about the 787, had entered commercial aviation after solid technical training. For him, every flight on the Dreamliner was still a fascinating novelty. June 12th would be his final flight. The sequence of events that led to the disaster unfolded in an impossibly brief period of time. After a 62-second takeoff roll along the runway, the 787 rotated at a speed of 155 knots, equivalent to approximately 287 kilometers per hour, and lifted off 4 seconds later at 13:38:39 local time. The aircraft began gaining altitude normally. It reached its maximum recorded speed, 180 knots, approximately 330 kilometers per hour, when it was barely 15 meters above the ground. The climb maneuver was proceeding exactly according to established procedures, and it was precisely at that moment, 3 seconds after takeoff, that something occurred which the flight recorders captured with a degree of precision that would prove both revealing and insufficient. At 13:38:42, the fuel control switch for engine number 1 moved from the run position, which allows the normal flow of fuel to the engine, to the cut-off position, which stops it immediately. 1 second later, at 13:38:43, the switch for engine number 2 did exactly the same thing. Both engines immediately began losing thrust. The aircraft was no longer climbing, it was gliding. With 242 people on board, with full fuel tanks for a 9-hour intercontinental flight, at an altitude of 15 meters above one of the most densely populated neighborhoods in Ahmedabad, the pilots attempted to reverse the situation. Approximately 10 seconds after the cutoff, the switches returned to the run position. But the 787 was too low, too slow, and too close to the ground for any engine response to matter. Only engine number 2 responded partially, relighting incompletely. The thrust it generated was entirely insufficient to stop the descent. From the Ahmedabad control tower, controllers followed the aircraft's path on the radar screen until the signal disappeared beyond the airport perimeter. Seconds before impact, someone in the cockpit had transmitted a Mayday emergency signal. The tower received no response. The 787 struck the student residence complex of Byramji Jijibhoy Medical College, known as BJ Medical College, only 1.7 kilometers from the airport runway in the Meganinagar neighborhood. The aircraft did not plunge nose first, which is significant. The nose was raised approximately 8 degrees when the tail struck the upper section of the campus dining hall. The initial impact was against a tree. The fuselage then disintegrated as it collided with the university buildings, scattering the wreckage across an area measuring approximately 300 by 120 meters. The landing gear was never retracted during the climb, a fact that some analysts interpreted as evidence that the pilots did not have time to carry out the normal post-takeoff procedures, or that they attempted to preserve the option of an immediate emergency landing. 5 campus buildings were severely damaged by the impact and the subsequent fire, including student dormitories and a residence for medical interns. The fire reached temperatures of 1,500 degrees Celsius, which greatly complicated rescue efforts and the identification of the victims. More than 300 firefighters, 60 fire engines, and 20 water tankers were deployed at the site. Access roads to the area were closed to traffic. Units from neighboring cities such as Vadodara and Gandhinagar joined the Ahmedabad emergency teams. Of the 242 people on board, 241 died. On the ground, another 19 people were killed, including 4 medical students who were inside the campus facilities. 67 people were seriously injured, many of them suffering burns of varying severity. It was the world's deadliest aviation accident since the German wings, a 320 crash in the Alps in March 2015, and the first involving the total loss of a Boeing 787 Dreamliner since the type entered service in 2011, 14 years earlier. Airport surveillance cameras and the mobile phones of those near the campus recorded something that appears to contradict all statistical logic of survival. A man walking unsteadily, his white shirt soaked in blood, emerging from the smoke and wreckage. That image, which began circulating on social media within minutes of the impact, even preceded coverage by the news media and was the first indication that someone might be alive. Vishwash Kumar Ramesh was 40 years old and a British citizen of Indian origin, residing in Leicester. He had spent the previous 8 or 9 months in India visiting relatives and was returning to the United Kingdom with his brother. He occupied seat 11A, an emergency exit seat located beside the aircraft's left wing in the 11th row. Emergency exit areas have structural characteristics different from the rest of the fuselage. The reinforcement of the door and the surrounding frame creates an area of greater local rigidity that may behave differently during an impact. When the impact occurred, the section of fuselage in which Ramesh was seated separated from the rest of the aircraft. The disintegration of the aircraft as it collided with the campus buildings was not an instantaneous process but a sequential one. The 787 broke apart into segments as it struck different structures, and Ramesh's section came to rest on the ground floor of the university residence. The emergency door opened or was torn away during the collision, and Ramesh escaped through that opening. Minutes later, he called his father on his mobile phone to tell him that he was alive. During that call, he said he did not know where his brother was and did not understand how he had escaped from the aircraft. Ramesh suffered facial cuts, burns to his left hand, and various bruises. The doctor who treated him at Ahmedabad Civil Hospital stated that his condition was not very critical and that he could be discharged within a few days. He was in fact discharged 5 days after the accident. 6 days later, he attended the funeral of his brother who had also been traveling on the flight and did not survive. He was later diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. In statements to the media, he described how, seconds after takeoff, the cabin filled with green and white emergency lights, how he felt the engines increasing power in an attempt to stabilize, and how the aircraft seemed to stop in mid-air for an instant before plunging downward. His survival was described as miraculous even by aviation safety experts. David Susi, a former FAA inspector and CNN safety analyst, noted that the position of seat 11A, directly above the main wing spar, was statistically one of the least favorable places from which to survive an impact of that magnitude. The wing spar would pass exactly beneath that area, and it would be a solid point of contact with the ground, Susi said. What saved Ramesh, according to subsequent analyses, was a convergence of factors. The aircraft's slightly nose-up orientation at the moment of impact, which reduced the impact energy in that specific section of the fuselage. The nature of the fuselage rupture, which separated that section before it absorbed the full energy of the impact, and the fortuitous opening of the emergency door, which provided him with an escape route. The survival of a single person out of 242 is sufficiently unusual that it generated, in some corners of social media, conspiracy theories questioning whether Ramesh had actually been on board. Those theories were quickly disproved. Ahmedabad Police Commissioner G.S. Malik confirmed that his seat number matched the flight's official records. Ahmedabad Civil Hospital confirmed that he had been treated as a survivor of the accident. His boarding pass was shown to the media while he was hospitalized. The intensity of the post-impact fire, with temperatures that the Ahmedabad Fire Brigade estimated at approximately 1,500 degrees Celsius, made the identification of the victims a long and technically demanding process. The flames destroyed much of the physical evidence and made visual identification impossible for most of the deceased. The identification process was carried out primarily through DNA analysis and was not completed until June 28, 2025, 16 days after the accident. Among the victims was Vijay Rupani, who had served as Chief Minister of the state of Gujarat between 2016 and 2021. His body was identified through DNA on June 15th. The presence of such a high-profile politician among the passengers added another dimension to media coverage of the disaster in India. Prime Minister Narendra Modi visited the crash site on June 13th, the day after the impact. For BJ Medical College, the impact was a catastrophe within the catastrophe. 4 medical students died on the campus grounds. 6 relatives of resident doctors also lost their lives. Another 24 people connected to the hospital were receiving treatment for injuries, according to the Federation of All India Medical Associations. The campus, which forms part of Gujarat's largest civil hospital, had to temporarily suspend some of its activities while rescue teams worked among the wreckage and the fire remained active. In modern aviation, the so-called flight recorders are in fact bright orange, designed to be visually located among wreckage. Flight AI171 carried 2 enhanced airborne flight recorders, abbreviated as EAFR, new generation devices that combine the functions of the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder into a single unit. Each of them is designed to withstand impacts of 3,400 G and temperatures of 1,100 degrees Celsius for at least 60 minutes. In theory, they are virtually indestructible. The first of the 2 EAFRs was recovered on June 13th, the day after the accident, from the roof of the university dining hall. The second was extracted from the wreckage on June 16th. Data from the forward recorder was successfully downloaded on June 24th at the AAIB laboratory in Delhi. The rear recorder, however, had sustained damage that prevented conventional data recovery, which proved to be a significant problem for the investigation. The possibility that this damage had occurred before impact, perhaps because of an internal lithium battery fire, was identified by some engineers as a relevant line of investigation. What the forward recorder contained was sufficient to reconstruct the physical sequence of the disaster with chronological precision. The flight data was clear. Speeds, altitudes, attitude angles, control positions, engine status. Everything recorded second by second. But the recorder also contained the cockpit voice recording, and within it was something that would trigger one of the most intense debates in recent aviation history. In the seconds immediately following the fuel cutoff, one of the pilots asks, "Why did you cut off?" The other replies, "I didn't do it." The AAIB's preliminary report, only 15 pages long and published on July 12, 2025, identified the technical facts precisely. Both fuel control switches had moved from run to cutoff 1 second apart, 3 seconds after takeoff. The report did not assign blame. It did not specify who had said what in the recording. It did not identify the speakers by their position or voice. It did not assign responsibility to either pilot. But that exchange remained in the record and would soon be leaked to the media. Compared with preliminary reports from other high-profile accidents, the AI171 report was notably brief. The preliminary report on the Ethiopian Airlines 737 MAX accident in 2019, a flight with similar characteristics in terms of loss of control shortly after takeoff, was 33 pages long and included excerpts from the cockpit recording, flight data traces, reproductions of the emergency procedures attempted by the crew, and a detailed analysis of system alerts. The AI171 report included none of that, prompting criticism from the international aviation technical community regarding the transparency of the investigation. On November 27, 2025, 5.5 months after the accident, the Wall Street Journal published an article that shook the aviation community and news media around the world. Citing sources close to the American investigators, the newspaper claimed that the cockpit voice recording indicated that Captain Sabharwal may have been the one who moved the fuel switches to the cutoff position. The operational logic supporting that interpretation was as follows. First Officer Kunda, as pilot flying, had both hands occupied with the flight controls during the initial climb maneuver, making it mechanically unlikely that he could have reached and operated the fuel switches at the same time. Sabharwal, as pilot monitoring, had greater freedom of movement and more direct access to the panel where the switches are located, immediately behind the thrust levers in the central position between the two seats. Ben Berman, a former senior NTSB official and a respected figure in the aircraft accident investigation community, publicly stated in July 2025 that, in his opinion, the preliminary report pointed to a deliberate act, based specifically on the fact that the switches had been operated sequentially, one after the other at an interval of exactly 1 second. An accidental simultaneous activation of both switches would be mechanically almost impossible given the design of the protective system and the locking mechanism of each switch. An action occurring with that time separation, Berman argued, suggested an intentional and methodical act. In January 2026, Bloomberg News reported that according to sources close to the investigation, investigators had leaned toward the conclusion that one of the pilots had deliberately caused the accident, having ruled out mechanical failures and external sabotage. This claim, attributed to anonymous sources, was reported by numerous international media outlets and temporarily consolidated the narrative of a deliberate act in the public coverage of the case. The reaction of the Indian aviation community was forceful. The Federation of Indian Pilots categorically rejected the hypothesis of a deliberate act and called for the investigation to focus on the technical evidence before assigning responsibility. The Indian Pilots Federation stated that publicly speculating about the intentions of a deceased pilot, based on a partial transcript of a voice recording that had not been released in full, was not an investigation but a rumor with consequences for the crew members' families. The Supreme Court of India intervened in November 2025 with a statement that halted the media escalation. It is extremely unfortunate that this accident occurred, but there is no insinuation against the pilot in the preliminary report. The investigation report merely records the communication between the two pilots and does not assign blame. That judicial intervention was significant because it made clear that from the Indian legal perspective, the investigation remained open and that the conclusions leaked to the press did not carry the weight of an official finding. Tensions between the investigation teams from the different participating countries were documented by several media outlets. The American investigators, according to the WSJ, saw in the voice recording a relatively clear indication that the captain had operated the switches. The Indian investigators called for greater caution, pointed to the absence of any known motive, the absence of prior signs of psychological disturbance in Sabharwal, and the existence of alternative technical evidence that deserved examination before conclusions were reached. To understand the technical debate surrounding AI171, it is essential to understand the design of the Boeing 787's fuel control system and the history of the warnings that existed about it. The 787's fuel control switches form part of the throttle control module, known as the Throttle Control Module, or TCM, and are located directly below the thrust levers between the two pilots on the cockpit's central pedestal. They have two positions: run, which allows the normal flow of fuel to the engines, and cut-off, which interrupts it immediately by cutting off the supply of kerosene to the combustion chamber. Under normal flight conditions, these switches are used only on the ground to start and shut down the engines. In flight, cutting off fuel to an engine is justified only in serious emergencies, such as an active engine fire or a failure requiring the engine to be shut down and possibly restarted. To prevent accidental activation, each switch has a spring-loaded locking mechanism that requires the switch to be pulled upward before it can be moved between the run and cut-off positions. Additionally, fork-shaped side guards surround each switch to prevent unintentional contact. Accidentally operating them would, in theory, require overcoming two safety barriers consecutively. This makes the accidental simultaneous movement of both switches extremely unlikely from an ergonomic and mechanical standpoint. But this is where the case takes on a dimension that goes beyond what happened in the cockpit on June 12th. In December 2018, the United States Federal Aviation Administration issued a special airworthiness information bulletin, identified as SAIBNM-18-33, warning that on certain Boeing 787-8 aircraft, including those equipped with part number 4 TL837-3D in the throttle control module, the fuel control switches might have been installed with the locking mechanism disengaged or incorrectly assembled. This made them potentially susceptible to unintended movement caused by vibration, accidental contact with the hand or body of one of the pilots, or flexing of the panel during flight. Part number 4, TL837-3D, was exactly the one installed on VT-ANB, the aircraft operating flight AI-171. The bulletin was advisory, not mandatory. According to Air India's own testimony to investigators, the inspections recommended by that bulletin were never carried out on that aircraft. The United Kingdom's Airworthiness Authority, the Civil Aviation Authority, had issued a warning 4 weeks before the A1171 accident about possible problems in the fuel system of certain Boeing aircraft, including the 787. The FAA had also issued an airworthiness directive related to fuel shutoff valves on several Boeing models. Taken together, these warnings formed a picture of regulatory concern about the reliability of the 787's fuel systems that existed before the accident and that did not result in mandatory corrective action in time. 8 months after the A1171 accident in February 2026, an Air India Boeing 787 operating between London Heathrow and Bangalore recorded something that set off every alarm. Before takeoff, the fuel control switch for engine number 1 spontaneously moved from the run position to cut off twice without either pilot having operated it. The aircraft was immediately grounded. The control module from that aircraft was removed and sent to Boeing's facilities in Seattle for exhaustive analysis. India's Ministry of Civil Aviation confirmed that the switch's locking mechanism had not properly engaged in the selected position, exactly the type of defect about which the FAA had warned in 2018. To understand the technical hypothesis offered as an alternative to a deliberate act, it is necessary to understand what happened on December 17, 2019, during an all-Nippon Airways flight between Tokyo and Osaka. That day, an ANA Boeing 787 was conducting its final approach to Itami Airport in Osaka. When the pilot deployed the thrust reversers to decelerate after landing, something unexpected happened. Both engines shut down simultaneously. The aircraft was already on the ground and there were no casualties, but the engineers investigating the incident found something disturbing. The TCMA system, an acronym for Thrust Control Malfunction Accommodation, had interpreted that the aircraft was on the ground before it had physically touched the runway. Believing that the aircraft was on the ground with the engines at full power, the safety system had automatically operated the fuel switches to cut off thrust, exactly as it would have done if a pilot had moved them deliberately. The cause was an erroneous reading from the sensors supplying data to the FADEC, the computerized engine control system. The FADEC, an acronym for Full Authority Digital Engine Control, is the brain of the engine in a modern aircraft. It receives data from dozens of sensors: aircraft speed, altitude, pressure, temperature, landing gear position, accelerometer readings, thrust reverser signals. Using all that information, the FADEC makes autonomous decisions about how to manage the engine. And in the ANA incident, an incorrect signal from a sensor had led the FADEC to make a decision that physically resulted in moving the fuel switches to the cutoff position. Aviation attorney Mary Schiavo, a former FAA inspector, was explicit in pointing out the analogy with AI171. "Nothing we have seen so far suggests pilot suicide or an act of murder," she told India's Financial Express. "The voices, words and sounds from the cockpit recordings must be analyzed extremely carefully. The tone, the context, the complete situation must be heard." Schiavo emphasized that the ANA incident demonstrated that the fuel switches could move from run to cutoff without human intervention if the aircraft software received erroneous signals from its sensors. In AI171, there was another technical fact that reinforced that line of analysis. The aircraft's maintenance records showed a stabilizer position transducer fault alert approximately 15 minutes before takeoff, detected by the aircraft's ACARS system. That alert was not classified as critical and the flight continued, but that type of fault in a flight control surface position sensor is exactly the kind of signal that can generate erroneous readings in the engine control system if the FADEC interprets that the aircraft is in a condition different from its actual one. The element that has most profoundly disrupted the narrative of a deliberate act is an image captured by the surveillance cameras at Ahmedabad Airport and rigorously analyzed by the Safety Matters Foundation of India, the SMF, beginning in April 2026. The image shows the Boeing 787 operating flight AI171 during its initial climb at an altitude of approximately 15 meters. Airport buildings and another parked Air India aircraft are visible in the background, and on the underside of the fuselage, clearly visible to any aviation engineer, there is a small device deployed outward from the aircraft, the ram air turbine, known by its English initials as the RAT. The RAT is an emergency turbine that remains folded inside the fuselage during normal flight. It deploys automatically without crew intervention, only under very specific conditions: loss of both engine-driven electrical generators, failure of the central hydraulic system, or a combination of both situations that leaves the aircraft without its main source of electrical and hydraulic power. Once deployed, the turbine uses the external airflow to generate a minimum amount of power that allows the flight controls to remain active during a total electrical emergency. On a normally functioning 787, the RAT should never be deployed during the initial climb. Its presence in that image, at low altitude and with the aircraft barely clear of the runway, indicates that something had failed catastrophically in the aircraft's electrical systems. The most detailed photogrammetric analysis of this image was carried out by engineer Ranjit John, founder of Hawkeye Data in San Jose, California. John triangulated the image with Google Maps data to determine the aircraft's exact position at the moment it was captured, with Flight Radar 24 data to correlate the position with the flight's chronological sequence, and with the camera's metadata to establish the exact moment of capture. His conclusion: the image was captured between 080839 and 080840 UTC. The movement of the first fuel switch to the cutoff position, according to data from the forward flight recorder, occurred at 80842 UTC. The difference is 2 to 3 seconds. It seems small, but in terms of causality, it is decisive. The RAT deployed before the fuel switches moved to cutoff. This means that the aircraft's electrical system had already failed before the fuel cutoff. The causal sequence supporting the hypothesis of a deliberate act, that is, that a pilot moved the switches and this caused the accident, requires the switches to have moved first. But if the rat deployed before the switches moved, something had already failed in the aircraft systems, and that initial failure could be the true cause of everything that followed. The SMF was categorical in its statement. The cause cannot follow the effect. If the electrical collapse preceded the movement of the switches, then the movement of the switches was a consequence of the failure, not its trigger. The possibility most consistent with that sequence is that the TCMA system, upon receiving electrical signals distorted by the collapse of the electrical system, had incorrectly interpreted the aircraft's condition and operated the switches autonomously, in the same way it did during the ANA incident in 2019. That image of the deployed rat, which was initially a background detail in the audiovisual material from the investigation, became the center of the technical debate about AI171 as 2026 progressed. Lawyers representing the victims' families in the United Kingdom and air safety campaign groups pointed to the image as the most important evidence in the case. The Indian AAIB did not comment on the SMF analysis in its anniversary statement. If the pilots did not move the switches, and if the electrical collapse preceded the fuel cutoff, the fundamental question is what caused that collapse during the first seconds of flight. The most elaborate answer constructed by engineers and analysts who do not subscribe to the hypothesis of a deliberate act points to a chain of cascading failures, with the aircraft's electrical system as the starting point. In terms of architecture, the Boeing 787 Dreamliner is an aircraft radically different from all its predecessors. Unlike earlier designs that relied on conventional hydraulic and pneumatic systems to operate flight surfaces, brakes, landing gear, and pressurization and anti-icing systems, the 787 electrifies practically everything. It is the first commercial passenger aircraft in which electrical power is not merely an auxiliary system, but the backbone of almost every critical system. This makes it extraordinarily efficient under normal conditions, but it also means that a major electrical failure is not a localized event, but the beginning of a cascade. Several technical indicators point to anomalies that preceded the accident. Records from VTANB's ACARS system showed a fault in the horizontal stabilizer position transducer approximately 15 minutes before takeoff. A position transducer is the sensor that reports to the flight management system where an aerodynamic surface is physically located. If that sensor reports an incorrect position, the flight software may misinterpret the condition of the aircraft. The aircraft's maintenance history also showed previous electrical system alerts in the days before the accident. One of the most revealing technical details in the AAIB's preliminary report was a fact that received virtually no attention in the initial media coverage. The engine thrust levers were found in the idle position after impact, but the flight recorder data indicated that they had remained in the fully advanced position until the moment of impact. This discrepancy between the physical position and the electronically recorded position could have several explanations. One of them, the most troubling from a technical standpoint, is that the thrust lever position sensors were reporting incorrect data, in exactly the same way that the sensors on the ANA flight had reported incorrect data in 2019. If the FADEC was receiving contradictory or erroneous signals from multiple sensors during the seconds after takeoff, its automatic behavior could have been unpredictable. The issue of the FADEC adds another dimension to the debate. Unlike Airbus, which provides relatively detailed documentation about the logic of the sensors that feed its engine control system, Boeing has historically maintained greater opacity regarding the internal algorithms of the 787's FADEC. Several pilots and engineers have expressed frustration at that lack of transparency, noting that even with the flight recorder data intact, there would be ambiguity about which signals the FADEC received and how it processed them. With the rear recorder damaged, that ambiguity is even greater. In the days following the accident, Air India acknowledged, without actively making it public, that it had carried out internal inspections of the sensors and electrical systems of its 787 fleet, in addition to the fuel switch inspections officially ordered by the DGCA. Those additional inspections revealed no problems. But the question engineers have raised is whether the inspections carried out were capable of detecting the specific type of intermittent failure that may have triggered the chain of events involving AI171. Regardless of the definitive technical cause of the accident, the investigation file has revealed a series of omissions in maintenance and safety protocols that analysts consider central to understanding why AI171 was possible regardless of who or what operated the switches. The first element is FAA Bulletin SAIBNM-18-33, issued in December 2018. The warning about fuel control switches with a potentially defective locking mechanism was known. The specific part number mentioned, 4TL837-3D, was exactly the one installed on VT-ANB. The aircraft's throttle control module had been replaced in 2019 and again in 2023, but the bulletin did not establish that replacement of the module was equivalent to the recommended inspection of the locking mechanism. Air India acknowledged to investigators that the inspections specifically recommended by that bulletin were never carried out on that aircraft. The second element is the GE Aerospace Bulletin. General Electric, the manufacturer of AI171's GEnx engines, had issued a service bulletin warning of possible thrust-related problems in the engines. Air India did not act on that bulletin either, which was likewise non-mandatory. The distinction between a mandatory airworthiness directive and a non-mandatory advisory bulletin is regulatorily significant but operationally dangerous when advisory bulletins describe failures with catastrophic potential. The United Kingdom Civil Aviation Authority had issued, 4 weeks before the AI171 accident, a warning about possible problems in the fuel system of certain Boeing aircraft. That notice led to no specific action regarding VT-ANB before its fatal flight on June 12. Air India operated in 2025 under the ownership of the Tata Group, which had acquired the airline in 2022 after decades of state management marked by inefficiency and a shortage of resources. The company was in the midst of a process of modernization, route expansion, and fleet renewal. AI171 was its first serious accident since privatization. The airline had a total of 26 Boeing 787-8s with an average age of 11.8 years, a fleet that, because of its age, required meticulous supervision of components subject to wear, and that, according to the case file, had not received all the preventive inspections recommended by the manufacturers. The Tata Group voluntarily announced payments of 10 million rupees, equivalent to approximately $100,000 to the families of each deceased passenger, in addition to covering the medical expenses of the injured. That amount, although significant, was criticized by some victims' groups as insufficient and also as an attempt to manage legal liability before the conclusions of the investigation could establish maintenance negligence. The investigation of AI171 is, under international air law, the responsibility of the Indian AAIB in accordance with Annex 13 to the ICAO Convention on International Civil Aviation, which establishes that the state where the accident occurs leads the investigation. Participating alongside the Indian AAIB are the US NTSB, the British Air Accidents Investigation Branch, Boeing as the aircraft manufacturer, GE Aerospace as the engine manufacturer, and the FAA as the airworthiness authority of the country of manufacture. This plurality of bodies, each with its own institutional interests, turns the investigation into a complex process that goes far beyond mere technical reconstruction. Friction between the investigation teams from the different countries has been documented by several media outlets based on anonymous sources on both sides. The American investigators, according to the WSJ, saw in the voice recording a relatively clear indication that the captain had deliberately operated the switches. The Indian investigators called for greater caution, pointed to the absence of any known motive, the absence of prior signs of psychological disturbance in Sabharwal, his impeccable record of more than 15,000 flight hours, and the existence of alternative technical evidence that deserved to be examined in depth before definitive conclusions were reached. Boeing also occupies an uncomfortable position in this investigation. If the cause of the accident proves to be a failure of the TCMA system or unexpected behavior by the FADEC, the implications for the certification and operation of the entire worldwide fleet of 787s would be enormous. The company has an obvious institutional interest in the investigation, concluding that the accident was the result of a human act and not a design or software defect. That potential conflict of interest has been explicitly pointed out by aviation safety groups calling for Boeing's role in the investigation to be supervised with particular rigor. ICAO Annex 13 establishes that the final investigation report must be published within 12 months of the accident, whenever possible. That deadline expired on June 12, 2026. Before that date, the Indian AAIB announced that it would publish an interim report instead of the final report, citing the extraordinary complexity of the investigation and the need to complete additional analyses related to the engines. The final report could take at least 3 more months. Only 52% of the 268 accidents recorded by IATA between 2018 and 2023 had investigations completed within the stipulated period. AI171 is heading toward becoming part of the minority that does not achieve it. 1 year after the accident, the definitive cause of AI171 remains officially undetermined. What has been established with certainty by the data is the immediate physical sequence. The fuel switches moved to the cutoff position, both engines lost thrust, the aircraft descended and collided with the university campus buildings. That is not in dispute. What is disputed, with an intensity reflecting the magnitude of the case, is why it happened. The hypothesis of a deliberate act rests on 3 pillars: the interpretation of the cockpit voice recording, the analysis of the position of each pilot in the cockpit, and the argument that no evidence was found of a mechanical failure that could have caused the movement of the switches. That hypothesis has a precedent: the Germanwings 4U9525 accident in 2015, in which co-pilot Andreas Lubitz deliberately locked the captain out of the cockpit and accelerated the descent of the A320. After Germanwings, the aviation industry introduced the rule that 2 people must always be in the cockpit, a rule that many airlines already applied, but that was not universal. The technical hypothesis rests on 4 pillars: the photogrammetric analysis of the RAT deployed before the fuel cutoff, the precedent of the ANA incident in 2019, and the behavior of the TCMA system, the anomalies in the aircraft's sensors recorded before takeoff, and the 2018 FAA bulletin regarding the potential defect in the switch locking mechanism. This hypothesis also has a technical precedent: the Ethiopian Airlines 737 MAX case in 2019, where an automated system, the MCAS, acted unexpectedly and fatally without deliberate intervention by the pilots. What makes this case particularly complex from an investigative standpoint is that both hypotheses are technically plausible in light of the available data. The voice recording is not conclusive by itself because it does not identify with certainty which voice belongs to whom, and because a denial in a situation of extreme panic is not definitive evidence of innocence or guilt. The sequential movement of the switches 1 second apart may be interpreted as a deliberate and methodical act, but it is also consistent with the operating mode of the TCMA system, which acts on the engines independently with small time intervals. The damage to the rear recorder deprived investigators of data that could have resolved the ambiguity about which signals the FADEC was receiving during the critical seconds. And the RAT analysis introduces a temporal variable that, if confirmed, challenges the causal sequence that would support the hypothesis of a deliberate act. The international aviation community is watching the case with attention that goes far beyond the specific accident. If the definitive cause proves to be a failure of the 787's automated systems, the implications for the global fleet of more than 1,000 aircraft of that type would be of a magnitude difficult to exaggerate. If the cause proves to be a deliberate act by one of the pilots, the debate over pilot psychological assessment protocols, which intensified after the Germanwings case, would regain an urgency that many airlines considered closed. And if, as some engineers suggest, the interaction between defective sensors, the FADEC and the TCMA system produced unexpected behavior that neither the pilots nor the system's designers had contemplated, the case would require an in-depth review of how modern aircraft, increasingly automated, make autonomous decisions in emergency situations. On June 12, 2026, the first anniversary of the accident, the Indian AAIB published a status statement confirming that the investigation had advanced significantly, that all available relevant evidence had been examined and analyzed, but that the final report was not ready. No publication date was provided. The engine analyses remain ongoing. The fuel control module from the 787 that experienced the spontaneous failure in February 2026 is being examined at Boeing's facilities in Seattle, with DGCA observers present. Air India permanently retired flight numbers AI171 and AI172. The Ahmedabad-London Gatwick route remained suspended until July 2025, operated between Ahmedabad and Heathrow between August and October, and was reinstated to Gatwick in the final months of 2025 under the new flight numbers AI159 and AI160. The airline suspended 83 long-haul flights over the long term to facilitate safety inspections, and the subsidiary Air India Express also retired the number IX171. The families of the victims in the United Kingdom, where 53 of the passengers resided or had ties, have organized pressure groups calling for the full publication of the cockpit voice recording transcript and the complete flight recorder data. Lawyers representing British families have stated that the partial nature of the information published so far makes an independent assessment of the conclusions that will emerge from the investigation process impossible. The accident involving flight AI171 was the deadliest in the world in 2025. The first fatal accident involving the total loss of a Boeing 787 since the aircraft entered service in 2011. Air India's first serious accident since its privatization in 2022. And the case that, 1 year later, still has no official answer regarding its definitive cause, suspended between the hypothesis of a crime and that of a technological failure, while the aviation industry waits for the investigation to conclude with the same rigor that the complexity of the case demands.